Long before memory learned how to remember itself, the world was gentle. The sun rose slowly over wide, breathing plains, spilling pale gold across tall grasses that bent and whispered with the wind. Rivers moved with patience, carrying reflections of clouds that did not yet threaten violence. Animals traveled in great herds, their hooves drumming a steady rhythm into the earth, as if reminding it that life was still abundant, still moving forward. Humans were few, but they were not afraid. They lived close to the ground, close to fire, close to one another. They did not know the word population, did not count themselves against the world. They simply existed within it. Children chased insects through dust that smelled of warmth. Elders watched the sky with eyes shaped by years of survival, reading signs no language had yet learned to name. At night, families gathered around small fires, listening to stories told not to entertain, but to remember who they were. In those days, the land answered when humans reached out. When hunger came, it did not stay long. When cold arrived, it left again. Seasons passed with rhythm, predictable enough to trust. The earth felt alive, but not hostile. It was a place where life could take root and expect, at the very least, a chance. No one noticed the beginning. There was no single moment when the world announced its change. No thunder to mark the turning, no voice from the sky. It began softly, almost politely, as if the planet itself hesitated before making such a terrible decision. The rains came later than they used to. At first it meant nothing, a delay of days, perhaps weeks. Humans waited, they always had. The elders said the sky would open soon, just as it always had. But when it finally did, the rain was thin, uncertain, as if it had forgotten how to fall. Grass grew shorter, rivers narrowed. The great herds shifted their paths, traveling farther than before, following scents of water that grew faint and unreliable. Hunters returned empty-handed more often, their faces calm but confused. Hunger began to linger, not as pain yet, but as a quiet presence that refused to leave. Children stopped laughing as much. Winters arrived heavier. The cold no longer felt like a visitor passing through. Fires were fed carefully now, guarded as if they were living beings that might choose to die if neglected. The elders watched the stars and felt something unfamiliar, doubt. They spoke of winters they remembered, of cold seasons survived, but their voices lacked certainty. This was different. The cold was not only in the air, it crept into the soil, into the roots of plants, into the paths animals once followed with confidence. The world was changing its rules. Human groups began to move, not with purpose, but with hope. They followed drying riverbeds, traveled toward distant hills, crossed plains that once provided everything they needed. But everywhere they went, the land seemed to echo the same message. There was less now, less water, less food, less warmth, and still, no one understood why. They did not know of ice sheets spreading across distant continents, or of the planet entering a brutal cycle that would last for hundreds of thousands of years. They could not see the vast forces shifting above and beneath them. Life was becoming harder. Small groups that once met and shared fires no longer crossed paths, trails faded, voices disappeared. Where there had once been smoke rising in the distance, now there was only sky. Humanity, never numerous to begin with, was slowly thinning, like embers spread too far apart to keep one another warm. The silence grew. Mothers rationed food without speaking of it. Fathers walked farther each day, returning later, carrying less. Children learned hunger as something ordinary, something to be endured quietly. Death, once rare enough to be mourned deeply, became familiar. Yet even then there was no panic. There was only endurance. Humans had always survived by adapting, by waiting, by trusting that balance would return. They believed the world would soften again, that this was only another test, another passing hardship. They did not yet understand that the test was unlike any before. The cold tightened its grip. Glaciers advanced in distant lands, reshaping the planet's breath itself. Winds grew sharper, droughts lasted longer, plants failed to return after winter. Animals vanished, not migrating, but disappearing altogether. Human numbers fell, not suddenly, but steadily. A camp would go quiet, a fire would go dark, a path would end. There were no monuments to mark these losses, no records carved in stone. Entire bloodlines vanished without sound, without memory, without anyone left to mourn them. And still, the earth continued its slow turning. By the time anyone realized the truth, it was already too late to stop it. Humanity was not merely struggling, it was being erased. From thousands of small groups spread across continents, humans were reduced to fragments, isolated clusters clinging to survival in pockets where the land had not yet fully betrayed them. Genetic lines collapsed. Diversity vanished. The human story narrowed to a fragile thread, stretched thin across an unforgiving world. At night, fires burned lower. Around them sat those who remained, wrapped in skins, listening to the wind move through dead grass. Children slept closer to adults now. Elders spoke less. The sky felt farther away, the stars colder, more distant than before. No one said the word extinction. They did not need to. Humanity was shrinking, not with violence, but with neglect. The planet was not attacking, it was simply no longer providing. And so, without ceremony, without witnesses, without warning, the greatest crisis our species would ever face began to unfold. A quiet ending seemed possible, and yet, somewhere in the cold, beneath a sky that no longer promised mercy, a few fires still burned. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. Morning arrived without warmth. The light touched the land, but it did not comfort it. It revealed what had been lost. Where grass once swayed, there was brittle ground. Where water once reflected the sky, there were only shallow scars carved into the earth. Reminders of rivers that no longer remembered how to flow. Those who woke did so slowly, their bodies heavy with hunger and cold. Those who did not wake were left where they lay, wrapped in skins that could no longer protect them. There was no strength left for long goodbyes. Grief had learned to move quietly, without sound. The world had become a place of absence. Human groups wandered through landscapes that felt abandoned, not only by animals, but by time itself. Days passed with no signs of life beyond the small circles of people who remained. It was something hoped for. Hunters left before dawn and returned after dark, hands empty, eyes hollow. Their bodies grew thinner, their movements slower. Each step required more effort than the last. Strength faded, not with drama, but with certainty. Muscles weakened, bones ached, breath came shallow in the cold air. Children learned to stop asking questions. Once, they had pointed at the horizon, asking when the herds would return, when the river would rise, when the world would feel familiar again. Now they watched quietly, conserving energy, listening more than speaking. Hunger reshaped their faces, pulling childhood away before it had time to fully arrive. The elders felt the weight of failure. They had survived many seasons. They had guided their people through storms, droughts, and migrations. But this was different. This was not a challenge to be solved with experience. It was a wall with no path through it. They watched the young grow weaker and knew that memory alone could not save them. Camps disappeared. Sometimes there were found cold ashes, scattered tools, bones left where bodies had fallen. Other times there was nothing at all. Paths ended abruptly, as if the people walking them had simply stepped out of existence. No messages were left behind, no warnings, just silence. Humanity was vanishing in fragments. Across vast distances, the same story unfolded again and again. Groups that had never met were experiencing the same slow unraveling. The planet had turned against all of them equally, without judgment or cruelty. It offered no explanations, only consequences. The population fell to numbers so small they could no longer be felt. There was no way for those living through it to understand the scale of what was happening. They did not know that nearly all humans were gone, that the species itself hovered at the edge of disappearance. They only knew that they were alone, and becoming more so with every passing season. Winter deepened. Cold settled into the ground and refused to leave. Fires struggled to stay alive, fed with anything that would burn. Sparks were guarded with devotion, passed carefully from one hand to another. A single mistake could mean darkness, and darkness now meant death. At night, people huddled close, sharing what little warmth they had left. Breath formed clouds in the air. Bodies shook uncontrollably. Sleep came in short, fragile moments, easily broken by pain or fear. Death no longer surprised anyone. It arrived quietly, often during sleep, when the body simply decided it could not continue. The living woke beside the still, already knowing what they would find. They closed eyes, they covered faces, they moved on. There were no rituals left for the dead. Energy was too precious, time too uncertain. Love remained, but it had learned how to let go quickly. Survival demanded it. Some tried to move toward distant lands, following rumors carried by chance encounters. Others stayed unwilling or unable to travel farther. Most never met another human group again. Isolation completed what hunger and cold had begun. The nights felt endless. Stars burned above a world growing emptier by the day. Fires flickered, then vanished. With each extinguished flame, something irreplaceable was lost: knowledge, stories, memory. Humanity's voice grew softer, thinner, as if the world itself were forgetting how to hear it. Mothers sang less, not because they no longer cared, but because songs require breath, and breath had become costly. When they did sing, the melodies were low and slow, meant to calm more than to celebrate. Lullabies carried the weight of goodbye, even when no one said the word. Some children survived when they should not have. Thin, quiet, watchful. They learned early that the world no longer promised fairness. They learned to endure hunger, to walk long distances without complaint, to sleep in cold without tears. These children carried something new inside them, not hope, but resilience. And still, many did not survive. The extinction did not roar. It whispered. There were no final battles, no sudden cataclysms. Humanity slipped away piece by piece, as gently as breath leaving the lungs. By the time the worst had passed, so few remained that the species could barely recognize itself. From countless bloodlines, only a fragile handful endured. The earth did not pause. Seasons continued. Ice advanced and retreated. Winds shaped the land as they always had. The planet felt no guilt. It simply moved forward, unaware that it had nearly erased its most curious creation. And yet, somewhere in the cold, beneath skies that no longer offered comfort, a few human fires still burned, weak, flickering, but alive. Please like, share and subscribe my channel. The fire was smaller now, but it was everything. It burned low, close to the ground, its light barely strong enough to push back the darkness. Hands hovered over it carefully, palms open, as if in prayer. No one spoke while feeding it. Every twig, every scrap of dry grass was placed with intention, as though the flame itself could feel gratitude. Around this fire sat those who remained. They were few, so few that each face felt essential, irreplaceable. Every breath mattered, every heartbeat carried weight. The silence between them was not empty anymore. It was filled with attention, with awareness, with the knowledge that nothing could be wasted. Not words, not warmth, not life. They had learned, not through wisdom, but through loss. Movement had changed. Once, people traveled widely, following animals and seasons. Now they stayed close to what little remained. Caves became shelters. Valleys became refuges. Any place that offered protection from wind and cold was treated like a gift. Fire was guarded day and night. It was never allowed to die. Someone was always awake, watching its breath, feeding it slowly, whispering to it without sound. The flame was no longer just warmth. It was memory. It was continuity. If the fire lived, humanity lived. Food was shared differently now. There were no private meals, no hoarded portions. What was found was divided evenly, measured by need rather than strength. The old ate less so the young could eat more. The strong carried the weak. Survival had become collective or impossible. Strangers were no longer feared. When another human appeared thin, exhausted, eyes wide with caution, it was not seen as a threat. It was seen as a miracle. Two small groups meeting meant stories could be exchanged, knowledge shared, strength multiplied. Humanity, scattered and nearly erased, had learned the power of connection too late but not too late. They taught one another what worked, where to find hidden water beneath frozen soil, how to shape stone more efficiently, how to preserve embers during travel. Knowledge was no longer something passed casually. It was sacred, spoken carefully, repeated often, carried like a fragile inheritance. Children listened more than they spoke. They watched hand-shaped tools, watched elders read the land, watched the fire's behavior in changing winds. They absorbed survival not as lessons, but as instinct. Their small bodies adapted to hunger and cold in ways their ancestors never needed to. Birth became rare. When it happened, it was treated with quiet reverence. New life was not celebrated loudly, it was protected. The group moved more carefully, slept closer, watched the world with sharper eyes. Each child felt like a promise the future had almost refused to make. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world softened. The cold still came, but it no longer stayed as long. Seasons began to shift again. Ice retreated from certain lands. Plants returned hesitantly, as if testing whether it was safe to grow once more. The survivors noticed, not with joy, but with cautious attention. They did not trust the change yet. They had been betrayed before. Still, they allowed themselves to hope in small ways, walking a little farther, staying a little longer, breathing a little easier. The fires burned steadier. They were still few, still fragile, but they endured. Smoke rose again into the sky, thin but visible. Humanity's signal, barely noticeable, yet unmistakably alive. Those who survived were not the strongest. They were not the fastest, nor the most aggressive. They were the ones who shared, who waited, who adapted, who chose cooperation over isolation when fear would have been easier. Their bodies carried the memory of loss. Their blood carried the lessons of near extinction. Diversity had collapsed. Lineages had vanished. What remained was narrow, fragile, but real. Humanity had been reduced to its smallest form, and it held. At night, around the fire, stories returned, not long ones, not elaborate ones, just enough to remember who they were. Stories of warmer times, of animals that once filled the plains, of people who were gone but not forgotten. The wind moved through the grass again, not loudly, not violently, just enough to remind the survivors that the world was still breathing. And as long as it breathed, so could they. The fire crackled softly, and in that quiet sound was something that had almost disappeared from the earth. Continuance, please. Like, share, and subscribe my channel. The world did not return all at once. It healed slowly, cautiously, as if uncertain whether life still deserved another chance. The cold loosened its grip in some places while holding tightly in others. Ice retreated by small, patient steps. Rains found their way back to valleys that had long forgotten the sound of water. The survivors noticed the changes not with celebration but with quiet attention. They had learned not to trust sudden kindness from the world. Still, they followed the signs. Plants returned, fragile but real. Animals appeared again, cautious shadows moving across land that had nearly forgotten them. The earth, scarred but breathing, began to offer life once more. Humanity followed. The small groups grew, slowly, carefully. Children survived long enough to grow strong. Elders lived long enough to teach. Fire traveled with them, passed from camp to camp, never allowed to fade. With it traveled memory, how to endure, how to adapt, how to stay together. The great narrowing of humanity had already happened. What remained was a fragile thread, stretched across generations. Genetic lines had collapsed into one another. Diversity had been stripped away by the cold and hunger. Every human alive now carried pieces of the same small group, but had refused to disappear. Time moved forward. Thousands of years passed, then hundreds of thousands more. The climate shifted again and again. Humans spread across continents, crossed mountains, followed coastlines, learned to shape the world around them. Languages formed, cultures emerged, cities rose, names were invented, histories were written, but the memory of that near ending never fully left the body. It lived quietly in the blood. Every human heartbeat that came after carried the echo of those last fires. Every breath was possible only because a few fragile groups endured when nearly all others were lost. You do not feel it, but it is there in your resilience, in your adaptability, in your instinct to connect. You are not as far removed from them as you think. The hands that once hovered over dying embers are connected to yours. The eyes that watched the cold horizon with fear and hope are reflected in your own. The choices they made to share, to protect, to stay together are written into your existence. Had they failed, you would not be here. No language would be spoken, no music would be played, no stories would be told. No one would look up at the night sky and wonder. The world would be quieter, emptier, unaware of what it had lost. But they did not fail. They endured a trial no other species has faced and survived. Not through dominance, but through care. Not through conquest, but through connection. Humanity's greatest strength revealed itself at the very edge of extinction. The fires never went out. They grew, multiplied, transformed. From small flames in frozen valleys to hearths in villages, to cities glowing across the planet. Every light you see at night is a continuation of that first fragile warmth guarded by trembling hands. And now, here you are, listening, breathing, existing. You are the future they could not imagine but made possible. You are the proof that survival can become meaning, that endurance can become beauty, that even when the world turns against life, life can choose to remain. So when you feel small, remember this. Your existence is not accidental. It is inherited courage. It is ancient persistence. It is the echo of humanity's quiet refusal to disappear. Long after the cold, long after the silence, the story continues. Through you. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel.